The Headless Horseman. What do we know about Sleepy Hollow? What do we know really about Sleepy Hollow? Oh, yes, we all know the story of Ichabod Crane and how he was caught in an unfortunate love triangle with Katrina Van Tassel and Brom Bones, and how on a fateful night he rode out on his horse Gunpowder, his borrowed horse Gunpowder, and was met by the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. The story was written by Washington Irving. It's not a novel, it's not a book, it is a short story. It's only about 12,000 words. But that short story has had a great deal of influence in American culture. And today I would like to talk a little bit about a couple of more recent retellings of the story from a feminist point of view. Now, that may sound a little strange, but stop and think about this. Washington Irving was a man in a man's world when things were written by men. Stories were written by men, books were written by men, they were sold to men. Not exactly only men. There were, of course, the Bronte sisters in England and Jane Austen and others who were writing as well. But it was largely a story told, or largely a world of stories told by men. And those stories, of course, became classics in the Gothic tradition. And Sleepy Hollow was part of a collection of stories written by Washington Irving when he lived overseas. He didn't actually write it while living in the area of Tarrytown, New York. He eventually moved there, but during the time that he wrote Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he was living in Europe. And he published it as a set of stories and essays, sketches as they're called, that were sent to America to be published. They were also published in Britain under the title of The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent. Gent, of course, being an abbreviation for gentleman. Throughout much of his early career, Washington Irving tended to write with a pseudonym, and that's what was going on in this case. So he wrote the story, and he went on to write many other books. He wrote other books of stories. He never really wrote novels per se, but he did write some histories. He wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus. He wrote a biography of George Washington. And he did a number of other writing projects, of course, during his lifetime. But the one thing that he seems most remembered for, the thing that he is famous for, is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Well, actually, two things, because also in the sketchbook there's a story by the name of Rip Van Winkle, you've probably heard of before, and those two stories, which were written under a pseudonym, his normal pseudonym for this book was Geoffrey Crayon, as we already said in the title, but he also used a pseudonym called Dietrich Knickerbocker, and Dietrich Knickerbocker was the name he wrote his first book under, and he occasionally used it for other stories. As a matter of fact, these two stories are the only ones in the sketchbook that were written by Knickerbocker. And they're somewhat of a different character than the other stories. They're kind of folksy, and they have this setting in the Hudson Valley, where Washington Irving spent part of his youth, and became, of course, as I've said, an American classic. So, what about these feminist retellings? What are those about? Well, once a story is written, and once it becomes part of the public domain, which happens 70 years or so after an author dies, the times vary over the course of history, but after an author dies and his heirs have had the benefit of his work or her work, the copyright expires and works become public domain, which means anybody can use them. You are not supposed to claim that you wrote them, but you may publish them. And so if you go looking on Amazon or bookshop.org, looking for collections called The Headless Horseman or Sleepy Hollow or something like that, you'll find plenty. Many of them are self-published. Anybody can do it. You just get the files or type it in yourself and you can publish it. But as I say, it's a short story. It's not an entire novel. But once it's out into the public domain, people can do whatever they want with it. They can make movies, and there have been movies made, television movies, theatrical movies made of Sleepy Hollow. And there are other things you can do as well, such as write your own version of the story. There are two that I'd like to discuss today, and I'll discuss them in the order in which they were published. The first one is The Spellbook of Katrina Van Tassel by Elissa Palumbo. This book was written just a few years back, and it is a retelling of the story from the point of view of Katrina Van Tassel. If you don't know the story very well, you might not realize that the central tension that is going on here is that Ichabod has fallen in love with Katrina Van Tassel, or at least her money, and Brom Bones, Abraham Van Brunt, is her previous lover and still lover, and she in the story plays them off against each other to get what she wants. But here we have the point of view of Katrina, a young woman, and in Washington Irving's story, she's only 18, a young woman who is caught between two lovers and taking the initiative to do what she wants to get the man she wants. In this case, the Spellbook of Katrina Van Tassel, the true lover is Ichabod Crane. She's really in love with him. And Katrina also practices a little bit of witchcraft. She probably drew that in from the story as it was presented by Tim Burton in the movie Sleepy Hollow in 1999, where he also had a witch character, Ichabod's mother. And so this story plays into that idea that an empowered woman might be able to get herself into a position of some satisfaction in a man's world. It's a very interesting retelling. If you're not quite used to it, the style, it is more of a romance than anything else, more than a horror story. But still, it's got elements of the horror story in it, and it's quite a creative retelling. Another more recent rendition, simply titled Horseman by Christina Henry. Now, this story is a little bit different, and it's got a kind of a twist ending, what we might call a fractured fairy tale. After those stories when I was young and used to see them on TV, where fairy tales had an unexpected twist or ending. And that's what's happening here. This one is actually set a couple of generations after the story of Ichabod Crane. And so Brom Bones has married Katrina Van Tassel, and they have a son, and not only a son, but also a grandson. Now, the grandson was born as a girl, which is one of those twists that we come to find in much of Henry's work. And this girl wants to be a boy and wants to be known as a boy. And so she is a boy in the story. And her hero is her grandfather, Brom Bones. Now, why is she idolizing her grandfather? Well, her parents were killed under mysterious circumstances. And this is because of a haunting entity in the woods of Sleepy Hollow. That haunting entity is not necessarily the Headless Horseman. You have to read the book to find out what's really going on here. But the story is much more in line with our thinking today, that gender is not something that is an assigned identity, or it tends to act that way in society, but it is a part of who we are. It's a part of how we understand ourselves. And Henry's characters throughout her writing tend to claim their own gender as the story goes on. And it's a much more 21st century telling of the story of the Headless Horseman. Now, these are only two of many, many retellings. And if we had all day, I could tell you some more. But at this point, these stories are a good way to understand how a classic like Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, lives on in American society and attains almost mythic stature. So I would encourage you to read these two books if you're interested in Sleepy Hollow, and maybe take in a movie or two. One thing I would encourage you not to do is start smoking. This pipe is just a prop. And I would thank you for your time. And if you like videos like this, think about subscribing or clicking the bell for notifications of new videos down in the stuff below the video here. And I will be back to discuss literary horrors of another sort at another time. Thanks for watching.